Field note number 39, when enrichment becomes a condition of care. The USDA question, when does it become required? Over 4 years ago, I sat down with Collin Funkhouser on Pet Sitter Confessional podcast episode number 132 and tried to explain how we onboard cats to the Finicky system. At that time, Collin described our process as holistic, not because it was vague or philosophical, but because there wasn't a better language yet for what we were building. A process of cat care evaluation that encompassed a cat's whole world to ensure not just food, water, or litter box, but an entire care plan that included the cat's own comfort and anxiety levels. Environmental programs from music to cat TV, foraging treat games, to the favorite snuggle. The interview feels like a million miles and a million years ago now. It was the early moment where pet sitting learned about something at Finicky we now call enrichment. It is found to be so valuable in our every day-to-day work that it is now taught throughout the industry and at conferences by other experts. We know it is a wonderful part of the care plans we put together for our clients. It is a professional add-on in many cases. One of the many realize is actually essential care for cats and dogs. What happens, though, when the USDA starts to catch up? Everyone is talking about enrichment, but the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service is asking a different question entirely. Does it actually meet the standard for dog welfare? That is not the same conversation. Enrichment is widely discussed, frequently marketed, inconsistently applied, but it is not really defined or measured or documented as a condition of care. And once it influences behavior, it stops being optional. And again, the law is looking at outcome-based care. The industry may still describe enrichment as an added benefit, but as the broader animal welfare framework evolves, the question will shift from whether it is offered to how is it being used and whether it is sufficient. The current public response makes that gap visible. The USDA asked for input on exercise, socialization, and behavioral welfare. The conversation immediately expanded into the vaccines and the breeders and the shelters and the personal experiences. What's missing is structure. The pet sitting industry didn't shift away from task-based care. It simply layered enrichment on top of it. But once outcomes become the measure, layering is no longer enough. There is no shared language for what adequate exercise looks like. No consistent way to evaluate socialization outcomes, and there's no framework for understanding how insufficient stimulation affects behavior in real-world handling conditions. That absence matters because behavior is not neutral. It is responsive. If shifts based on inputs or enrichments, and those enrichments include stimulation, routine, environment, and change, when those inputs are inconsistent, behavior becomes less predictable. When behavior becomes less predictable, risk increases. That progression is not theoretical. It is observable in everyday pet care work, especially in moments that precede incidents. The hesitation at the door, the stiffness during feeding, the dog that watches instead of relaxes. Once enrichment is understood as an input that influences behavioral stability, it moves categories from nice to have to required to have. Right now, the pet sitting industry treats enrichment as a benefit. It is positioned as an enhancement to care, something that improves quality of life, but sits outside the core structure of the pet sitting service delivery. But once it influences behavior, it becomes a variable that affects outcomes. And variables that affect outcomes require control. And control, when questioned, requires evidence. Without that shift, enrichment remains subjective, dependent on individual interpretation rather than consistent practice. That is actually what the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service and federal regulators are trying to understand now, before any rulemaking begins. This is where the regulatory question becomes sharper. If exercise and socialization are tied to welfare outcomes, then they are no longer optional features of good care. They are conditions of care, a baseline, not a feature. And conditions of care carry an expectation of consistency, documentation, and defensibility. It is not enough to say enrichment was provided. The question becomes, how was it provided, whether it was sufficient, and what impact it had on the animal's behavioral state. Where the pet care industry lives. The pet care industry, as it currently operates, does not have a standardized way to answer those questions. Most providers rely on experience, intuition, and informal notes. Those are valuable, but they are not structured systems. They do not produce consistent data, and they do not demonstrate control over the variables that influence behavior. As even the federal government begins to ask the question, does enrichment matter in a regulatory or liability context, that gap becomes significant. What is emerging, whether intentionally or not, is a shift from philosophy to measurement. The conversation is moving away from what good care looks like and toward what can be evaluated, compared, and verified. That shift does not require abandoning enrichment. It requires reframing it, not as an optional add-on, but as a behavioral input that must be understood in terms of its effects on stability, predictability, and risk. Those factors are what affects animal welfare obligations. Because once a variable influences behavior and behavior influences outcomes, the question is no longer whether it matters. Pet sitters already understand the value of enrichment. What they may not realize is the moment it is recognized as a factor in animal welfare at the federal level, it begins the transition from something you offer to something you may be expected to demonstrate. Years ago, we described this as holistic care or an environmental program, looking at an animal's whole world and adjusting it to support comfort and reduce stress. Today, those same inputs are being examined through a different lens, not as a philosophy, but as factors that influence measurable welfare outcomes. You can find this discussion further at Pet Sitter Confessional episode 132 that I did 4 years ago. You can find the USDA public input on updating dog welfare regulations, and their comment period is extended now until April 20th, 2026. They're asking that this effort reflects the USDA's commitment to strengthening dog welfare nationwide, a top priority for Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins. The review will focus on care standards for breeding females, as well as requirements for exercise and socialization, and areas where science and best practices have advanced significantly since the early 1990s. And in other places, I am continuing this conversation because it's no longer theoretical. It is shaping how care is being evaluated both in the field and at the regulatory level. I'll be continuing this discussion in far more detail during an upcoming Pet Sitters International Focus Summit session this May, where we'll look at how behavior, environment, and decision-making come together in real-time care, and how your behavior knowledge, when applied consistently, protects the pet, the client, and the professional providing the service. Until next week, take care, and we'll see you then.